And we're live. Here we are,
Hello.
Adam Johnson. Thank you for being here, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Justin.
Adam, I'm so impressed by your work. Especially, I found you. I was like, I can't remember what it was, but it's something like Django like Flask or Flask like Django. And I found your blog post on doing the single page Django application, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And that kind of got me down the rabbit hole of all the things that you're working on otherwise. What made you start with, or actually even think about writing that article? Like, what was it that like inspired you to be like, oh, I'm going to do a single page Django application? Well, maybe 2 pages because of tests. I think you even make that joke. Um,
Yeah.
what made you do that? What was it?
Um, I was working actually with a number of different single file Django apps for different things I was working on. One was an APM product that integrates with Django. So for tests, we didn't want to set up a giant project. We wanted the minimum one possible. So I'd done that. I'd also come across the technique from other people like the fellow Carlton Gibson who gave a talk. And I thought that actually this single file app, it makes a good lens into seeing how Django works. And then I wrote a post comparing it with Flask and like in what ways can we already see in 30 lines of code how Django differs from Flask, what the advantages of one or the other would be there.
Yeah. And like the motivation to actually share it, what was that? Was it specifically to help people like myself realize the comparison from a very low, like, I mean, a simple level? Is that part of the motivation? Or
Yeah, it's a really common question I get asked, like, what's the difference between Django and Flask? Which one should I pick? So I thought it was a good place to start.
Absolutely. So obviously you're partial to Django. When would you actually end up using Flask over Django? I just wanted to dive into these like questions.
Yeah, sure.
I'm like, I get asked these questions all the time too, so I want to hear your take on it.
um, Probably at this point it would just be if someone had already used Flask and I was working on that project. I think there's enough in Django that would keep me there. That even if you think the project is small and simple right now, you inevitably end up adding stuff, and you're like, oh, this thing's built into Django, whilst it's not built into Flask. So,
Very good
yeah.
point. I love that. I don't always think about that in terms of like how the project starts to scale, and that's when you'll need it. So it makes sense to go backwards, or at least not backwards, but go with the beast that is Django. So how long have you been with the development team?
So I submitted my first pull request to Django in 2014, I think. And in 2016, I was voted into the Django core team, which feels really recent, but actually now I realize it's nearly 5 years ago. Um, and then we kind of dissolved the concept of there being a core developers team, and instead there's various different teams within the Django Software Foundation. And one of those is the technical board, and that's 5 people who have oversight over whether features do or do not make it into Django. And for the last 3 release cycles, I've been voted onto the technical board.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're like one of the head honchos at Django. It's like nervous to talk to you, huh?
I guess so. The technical board doesn't require much day-to-day work, but we're there to break ties whenever there's a thing that's slightly contentious.
Oh, we're gonna have to maybe talk about things that are slightly contentious that causes breaking ties. But before we get there, so what's like the decision process to decide what actually goes into Django? Because there's a lot of like new frameworks, like Fast API is always like, oh, why not just use Fast API? Or why isn't the Django REST framework integrated into the core Django software stack? What's the decision making process there? Why do you decide to leave certain things out? How does that work?
Yeah, sure. On a per feature basis, if the feature is quite small and obvious, it will generally be accepted without much discussion. If you've got the code that will match it. So take the ORM, for example. We want the ORM to match pretty much anything you can do in SQL. If there's some feature that's missing, and there are many because SQL is so broad, and you suggest adding it, you don't really need a large conversation about that.
Sure.
If you can show how it works, that'd be fine. For larger things, the fellows, who are the two people working day to day, they might push you to go and make a post on the Django forum or the Django developers mailing list where more people can discuss it. If there's a few like positive votes and no real reasons not to, it will go ahead. It might require further discussion that could end up with the technical board being invoked.
Got it. So it has to be like put up for a vote for it to actually be eventually integrated. It's not like, I mean, you guys don't just as a board go, oh, this is a feature we would love to add to Django, let's add it. Or do you do that?
Yeah, for a larger thing, it would require all 5 of the technical board members to say yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So let's go back to the controversy. What is it that gets you kicked off of the technical board? And you don't have to name any names, but what is something that someone did in the past that like caused that to happen?
No one's been kicked off the technical board.
Okay.
It's I think it's possible under the document that defines how Django works, which is called DEP 10. So like Python enhancement proposals or PEPs, we have Django enhancement proposals, DEPs. DEP 10 is the one that restructured Django into the various teams fairly recently. For the technical board, it's all voted on per release cycle. And I think you could be removed from any posts inside Django if there were enough people, but I don't think anyone ever has been.
Got it.
The controversy is more like there might be a large number of users who want something, and we have to decide whether or not it goes in, and when it goes in, and how it goes in. The most recent one I'm thinking of is type hints. So they're getting great adoption across Python. I'm using them myself in a couple projects. And the question was, like, should Django be shipping type hints? And we came down on the side of no, not yet. There's a Django stubs project, which adds the type stub files for Django. And we'd like to see that become a bit more mature before we try and merge that over into Django. We would add quite a contribution overhead. Right? A lot of people aren't working with types. So that was the main reason we said, no, not yet.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. So you think maybe in 2-3 years, something like that, when it's a bit more further along, we'll see type hints?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah,
there are only a few people working on Django stubs, but we did have one sponsored person on the Google Summer of Code help out with it this past year.
So are you familiar with Elasticsearch and what they did recently with their open source?
Yes.
Has there been, I mean, I just want to know any talk of this potentially ever happening with Django where it's like, because obviously the big names like Instagram has used Django. I think Pinterest did as well. Like they're capturing a ton of value using Django. Is there any potential that Django might go the way of Elasticsearch, in which that they start to charge, or the Django Software Foundation starts to charge big clients like Instagram or Pinterest, start charging them to actually use Django, or is it always going to remain completely open source?
It's impossible that we'd go down that route because the Django Software Foundation is an American charity, so it can never charge for products. It can hamper our fundraising efforts a little bit because we can't offer literally any benefits. So even like a kind of priority support, we couldn't charge for. So yeah, Django's at no risk of becoming like that.
Wow, I wasn't even aware of that. So is there something with this specific charity that you can't charge for these things? Because even, I mean, I know there's other charities that can charge for things. They just, like, it's not like they can have profit. It's usually just a tax designation, right? So is there a legal thing that the Django Software Foundation has that prevents that from happening, the charging?
This is a bit outside my wheelhouse at this point.
Sure. Yeah.
I've always heard this argument from the main Django Software Foundation board, who oversee everything, that it just can't be done.
Got it. Yeah. Because I mean, I know when I was learning, there was, I mean, the documentation's fantastic. I don't know if you contribute to it at all. I'm sure you do, but it's like, now that I understand Django, it is like so easy to understand the documentation, and it leaves very little ambiguity while using so much of Django. But when I was starting, I definitely didn't feel that way. I was like, oh man, because you know, if you're learning how to code and you start with Django, learning the technical or how to read the documentation is like really, really tricky. So I always wondered if Django would actually have their own, like the Django Software Foundation would have all their own like video tutorials and like, I mean, a lot of the things that I do, but specifically published from you guys. Is that something in the works or?
No, I don't think so. Several of the people involved in like making Django, like myself, Will Vincent, the Roy Greenfelds.
Yeah.
We're all like authors on the side, and then we contribute to the framework / community. I think that's the model that works best for Django being made by a charitable foundation, there being a solid core that will be maintained forever, and then individual teaching around the outside.
Sure. Yeah. Cool. So I'm assuming you freelance a lot. Do you like help small businesses, medium-sized businesses building Django applications or any software stack?
Mostly focused on Django and Python. Kind of build myself as a consultant who could come in and find some problems. I have like a audit list that I'll go through on a typical Django or Python project, trying to find common problems that people haven't addressed at certain stages of a project's life cycle.
So this audit list, do you know it off the top of your head, or like, I'm really curious as to what the common problems that companies are making in production right now?
Yeah, sure. I think the one that's always top of mind for me is transactions. And this is something I'd like to improve back in Django as well. The default in Django is that there are no transactions per view or management command or whatever. So it's very common to write code that looks like it works at low scale, and then at high scale, you've got weird queries like, hey, why are we getting errors that, you know, in the typical banking transaction, why is the money gone from account A but not appeared in account B? And it's because the code crashed halfway through and a database transaction was not used.
Interesting. So how do you solve, well, let me back up. Finding that information, what is your process for actually finding out that the fact that a transaction wasn't used? What's your process for that? Do you look at their code base and do your own
code base? Yeah.
Oh, got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Is there anything else that you can think of?
I've tried to enumerate bunches of different things that I've come across and work on solutions. Like pinning versions is something that appears like up and down the stack, right? Like from pinning your version of Docker or operating system that you're using in production down to like each individual Python dependency and JavaScript dependency. Like quite often it gets missed somewhere. Even if it's done in some places, you got others, and then you end up with random errors because things upgrade without you noticing.
Got it. So how do you pin versions? What's your process for that?
So with Pip, I use a tool called Pip Compile, which is like a small layer to write your requirements.txt for you based upon the top level things you want. So you say you want Django, you compile that, you get multiple things out in the requirements.txt file pinned to exact versions, and then you can upgrade with the tool. It's a bit like pipm for poetry, but it's a much smaller layer that requires you to use pip the rest of the time.
Oh, that's cool. What was the name of it?
Pip Tools.
Pip Tools. Okay, cool. I'll have to check that out.
It's on Jazz Band. Yeah.
Jazz Band.
Something else I wrote is called Django version checks, which are some system checks for Django that when you start your project, it checks the environment is as expected. So you don't have any mismatches between like your local development and your testing system and your production system. So you say Postgres should be version 13, and it will check when it starts on each of those environments. So if you accidentally didn't pin Postgres on one of them, you would find out. So you could pin it back.
Oh, that's great. Wow. I feel like I'm missing out on something like an amazing tool that I should be using or should have been using for a long time. Did you find out about that from your work with the Django Software Foundation, or just in your own projects? Like how do you learn these things?
Yeah, that's why I like consulting and diving into different projects, because not only can I give something, I also end up taking back something from everything I look at, talking to different teams, finding different solutions that are out there. So just a lot of interacting with people and finding out what they're up to.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. So how do you get into consulting? Like, how would you even find clients? I get asked a lot of how do you get into freelancing? I would imagine you have a methodology for finding your clients right now.
I tend to rely on word of mouth at this point. So I just try and keep putting out a few blog posts and appearing on YouTubes and things like that. So people hear about me, and then clients will also refer other people once in a while, and that's enough. It just kind of bounces around.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you clearly know a lot. So getting into the Django, like being a technical board member, does that actually help you land consulting gigs? I would imagine it probably does.
It probably acts as a small credential. It also takes a lot of time. So I mostly do it to give back to the community rather than as like, hey, look at me.
Yeah. Well, I know being a member of the community at large, I'm very appreciative of everything that you guys do. I'm like always stunned by when I'm thinking of a feature that I want to add, and it's like, oh, Django already has it. It's so great. Like it's really a special framework in so many ways. Do you think that Django is going to be around for the next, let's say, 10 years? I think for sure 5, but beyond that, what's your feeling there?
I think it'll be around for at least another 15 years. It's 15. Done 15 years already. Let's say 15 again.
Wow.
I think the web is coming in cycles a bit as well. Like I see more of a move back to doing things on the back end using languages that you're comfortable with. Python is the #1 language in the world right now on the Stack Overflow survey.
Yeah.
Even if it drops down and other things come around, I don't see it like just disappearing, because it's got so many good ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think that there's going to be some major shakeup in the feature set for Django? Like, is there going to be a major rewrite where in 2 years, or maybe longer than that, but we're all like, all of us that started with, I think I started with 1.3, we're like, oh no, this is not Django anymore. This is a completely new thing, and I got to relearn everything. Do you think that's going to happen?
I don't. Django deliberately moves at a kind of slow pace. We have a very experimental stuff out in the community, in the ecosystem, and then things that stick, they will very gradually make their way into core. Like you asked earlier about Django REST framework, will that make its way into core? And the answer is like really, really slowly. So Django REST framework has a whole like content type checking system that uses the accepts header, and Django 3.1 gained the ability to read the accepts header, but not quite in the whole way that Django REST framework does, at least yet. So we kind of merge the best ideas in. A few things that are cutting edge need to be done in the framework. For example, async stuff. And Andrew Godwin is doing a lot of work on that to make Django 3.2, then 4.0 have more and more async features. But I can't imagine everyone will jump over to the async world for everything. It's quite different and a harder way of programming. Don't know if you've tried that out much.
I have, thanks to a lot of the work
Yeah.
from Andrew Goodwin. Yes, I don't prefer it. I mean, honestly, I like there's not a big performance gain where I'm like, oh my gosh, you have to absolutely use asynchronous programming for this. There's sure there's some things, but I'm really comfortable with Django, and if I need to offload tasks, I use Celery. Like I do that constantly. So I guess like, is there something like Celery or some sort of task queue like that that's also going to be integrated in, or is this like Celery has its place, we're going to leave it as Celery, we're not going to actually bring it over? Do you see that also as a part of your guys' methodology, that we keep certain features absolutely separate because they're great by themselves, so they don't need to be integrated into the core stack?
Yeah, Celery is an interesting one because a bunch of people use it. There's also like some more minor players in the task queue space, like Django Q and Huey and things like this. I think there's no real call to merge anything into Django core for doing background tasks. The use cases are just so vastly different that a full system is very hard to maintain.
Yeah. That it seems like a really delicate balance of what should go into the core Django and what shouldn't. Like I don't even know how you actually make that decision. You before we started talking or recording or going live, excuse me. You did mention a few things, but like, I mean, programming, the thing that's beautiful about it is we can take the tools that we have and we can either use the ones that are out there or build on top of it. And like, to me, Django's like this really nice foundation to build a really solid web application. But it's not something that you would have, packed up with PyInstaller and put on as a desktop application necessarily. I mean, maybe you've seen something like that, but it doesn't seem like you need to have it for every possible use case, because it won't be successful then. You're trying to please everything, and then it'll start to fall apart. But obviously there's a balance between that of like where Django is today and all of the things that are going to be added to it in the future, and then all the things that could be added to it. That, like, essentially, how do you say no to these things? Like, what is the process for saying no?
Yeah, I guess we have a kind of default no to rather large features, that there are often like requests for things that perhaps the author hasn't even checked out about how to integrate a third-party app like Celery. And like, if you have the motivation, you can probably convince everyone that it's a good idea to get into core, but it takes a lot of motivation. And often we'll ask for like a working implementation in a separate package. And by the point you've made that, like, it can sometimes be that there's no point in like merging it into Django, because you can maintain that as a separate package.
I feel like Django channels is one of those. I mean, I've heard talks of that being integrated into core Django. Is it still part of the roadmap, or is it going to stay a separate package?
I don't think there's anyone really pushing to merge it right now, but it might become inevitable with all the async stuff being added. And channels was always developed, again, by Andrew Goodwin outside of Django core, so that it could iterate quickly. But if it gets to a kind of fixed point and it's like the only sound way of doing WebSockets, etc., in Django, it probably would make sense to merge it.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, the WebSocket support, it's another thing that I get asked all the time. GraphQL, but it's like there's already really good packages that do these things that build on top of Django. So the position you guys are in is an interesting one. But I will say I really appreciate that even from Django like 1.3, I think that's the one I started with. It's still Django. Like, yes, there's new features. There's the migrations thing, getting rid of South. All that stuff was amazing when that happened. But like it's still Django. It still feels like Django. I can look at my really old code and be like, that's terrible code, but it's still Django. It's still the core. I really appreciate that about everything you guys do. And I'm glad that that's part of the ethos going forward. And it feels to me that something like the Django REST framework, it would be nice to have it in Django, but it's also nice that it exists so we don't actually have to build all those things from scratch. And then also people like yourself who write packages or maintain packages like django-cors-headers. Like, is that one that's going to be brought in, django-cors-headers? Because that's something I use all the time too. So thanks for maintaining that.
That is one I would like to bring in, partly because it would give a chance to like redesign it as well. Like it has some rough edges because it was kind of evolved through many different pull requests, and it's now at a point where we can see what features would make a core cause implementation. So I would like to put that into Django at some point. Or if someone put together a proposal, it would be a perfect like Google Summer of Code project, for example.
Oh yeah. What are your recommendations for beginners to move beyond being a beginner to being a more professional developer with Django? Do you have recommendations for that?
I can only speak to my own experience.
Perfect.
I guess one thing I wish I'd done earlier was read more code. And we're in a kind of golden age where there's like lots and lots of good packages, projects out there on GitHub that are free for you to go and dive into, see how other teams have solved the same problems. Like when you get started on your first kind of big Django project, or your second or third, if it can have been set up by a few team members at this one company once, and now you're just working within the framework of the decisions they made. Going and reading how other people have done the same thing different ways, it can really expand your mind, let you learn about features within Python, Django, your database, all these layers that you're working with, and you could otherwise get kind of railroaded down.
Yeah, it's great advice. I love it. Is there any support that's ever going to happen for MongoDB, like built into Django core?
Question that comes up a lot. So we have Aaron Bassett as a Django Software Foundation member. He's a fantastic Scottish guy who was until recently working at MongoDB. And he had a kind of answer that was like, it's not there, but he would channel information to the right people in MongoDB. I assume there's a bit less motivation there to do it. There's certainly not anyone in the main Django team who would do that, or like anyone who's a regular contributor. And the real problem is there's like a very big mismatch between Django's ORM, which leans heavily into SQL and all the guarantees and syntax of SQL, and the way MongoDB works. So yeah, I can't see any project on the horizon that's going to add that anytime soon. People are welcome to prove me wrong and try and implement a database backend. It can be done outside of Django. It's been done once before, I think, for a non-SQL database, and it wasn't entirely successful, as I understand. But it can be done. It's a question of who would do it.
Do you think it's even necessary? Like,
that's another thing. Like most of the regular contributors to Django would not see that as necessary. It could even like, if we tried to make Django fit to MongoDB, we would like be removing features from Django at this point, or you would get a very limited experience on MongoDB compared to any of the other backends that are in the core.
Yeah. I think it might be an issue of branding. There's just I mean, a lot of people just hear MongoDB and it's the future and all this stuff. So I think that's the thing, right? So like a lot of beginners, a lot of people that aren't that familiar with Django are like, oh, why can't I use MongoDB as the backend?
Yeah.
Although there is Django. Have you used Django yet?
I have not touched Django. No.
Yeah, so Django
I forgot about that. Yeah.
It's it works fine. But there's probably a bunch of features I didn't test, nor a thing to test. So I didn't use it in production. I just did a test version of it, and wrote a blog post about it. It's fine, but again, like it's like, why are you using MongoDB if you're using Django? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But that might be the problem: marketing and beginner mindset and all that.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of budgeting dollars behind MongoDB, DynamoDB, any of the other DB startups. Whereas, Postgres is not something that has any marketing budget, nor really MariaDB. I mean, some of them have companies, but Postgres doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder how many. Go ahead.
I think something that solves the main use case for a non-relational database is the JSON field, which now, since Django 3.1, is supported on all database backends. For when you want to store some unstructured data.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the. I call it JSON because I get called Jason a lot, so I try to like distinguish the two things, JSON. Anyways, but that JSON field I've been using for a long time, because before it was still built into Django. It just wasn't a core field. Is that what it was, or?
It was on Postgres only for a few versions. Yeah.
Oh, right. So how does it map to SQL or MySQL databases now?
Well, the progress is on the MySQL and SQLite sides. They added functions and the ability to work with JSON on their side. So we expanded it. It was a Google Summer Code project, again, by Sage Abdullah. He's been great.
Cool. So I don't know about the Google Summer Code projects. I've heard of it, obviously, but what is it? What are you doing in the Google Summer Code projects?
Sure. Google earmarks some budget and distributes it to different open source projects to further their aims. The idea is that we would put together a project that a university student in computer science or equivalent could work on over the summer. And they're typically quite targeted projects. This year, they've actually been shrunk, so they're even more targeted to adding one feature or cleaning up one particular piece of the implementation. So these tend to be some of the headline features in Django that get worked on through Google Summer Code, where a number of people have put together the idea that this thing should exist, but it's a matter of sitting down for 4 to 6 weeks and like implementing it. And so that program really helps with that.
Wow. So is this something that Google organized specifically for Django? Is it many other open source libraries?
Many open source projects contribute in it. And if you want to work with Django, it's best to like integrate with the community early. I've made a few pull requests to show that you know how the code base is working and how things are laid out and what the process is, and then we can accept you for a longer stint.
Interesting. That's really cool. So who manages that?
One of the fellows, Carlton Gibson, is quite on top of things, and several other people get to vote on the projects, and we get like tens of applications and can only accept 1 or 2. So it takes a bit of work to do that.
And the Google Summer of Code, do they like actually pay someone to manage these things, or are they paying the student, or both, or how's that?
They pay the student, and I think they make a small donation to Django, but I can't remember.
Got it. Oh, okay.
But yeah, there's like a stipend. Yeah.
Is that anything like, is it called Hacktober from DigitalOcean, or is it more specific?
It's a bit more structured and longer term. It's quite a commitment. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So that would be a good thing for a student who's wanting to work in more web development to get some experience, but also contribute at the same time. Sounds like.
Yeah.
Got
it. It's a fantastic way of getting into a large, stable, well-tested code base, which is something that can take a while to get into. Otherwise, if you go and join a startup, for example, and have a small project.
Yeah. So tell me about your book. Let's hear about it.
Sure. So my book is called Speed Up Your Django Tests. I think it does what it says on the tin. So you got some tests, you want them to go faster. It will help you get there. And it's turned out to be also quite a good way of like learning more about testing, because like good tests are fast tests. Like it's not necessarily true that fast tests are good tests, but if you have good tests, they're fast. So quite a lot of the information in there is about like how to structure tests, how to use testing features from inside Django and PyTest, and how they will all add up to 1 minute CI runs rather than 1 hour.
Whoa. So do you have a few tips off the top of your head? Obviously, the book is a big book, so there's a lot to go over. But maybe some common things that you see with beginners or just your consulting projects of things that they're not doing correctly with tests that automatically make them slower.
Yeah. It's not a huge book. I know at least one reader has like read it in one evening. It's 195 pages though, so it is quite dense with code and examples. There are a few things top of mind. Some of them are like features that have made their way into Django 3.2 even, which I covered in a blog post recently. So the main one is test data. With Django, we're always testing against our database. Writing stuff to a database is going to disk. Disk is fairly slow. There's ways to speed that up by like not using a real disk, but using an in-memory disk. So memory is like 10 times faster than disk already. So that can make your queries maybe 3 times faster in reality, because a lot of the stuff is actually Postgres or whatever doing its work before it goes to the disk. And then like just writing less data. So a key feature is in Django's test case class, it has something called setup test data.
Mm-hmm.
So many people are used to using the setup function, which lets you do something before each test. Setup test data does it once for the class. So if you're creating a user that you need to log in each test and like make a request, you could move it from setup into setup test data and then do it once rather than say 20 times for 20 tests.
Yeah. I wasn't aware of that. So setup is triggered for each test, correct?
Yep.
Whereas setup test data is triggered once. And how long has this been in Django?
Since 1.6, 1.7, maybe.
That's hilarious.
It's not so usable though. One of the problems it's had is it doesn't isolate the in-memory model instances. So you could create it in your setup test data. And then if you make a change in one of your tests, that change will persist until the other tests to the in-memory copy, but not the database. So you already get this kind of weird world that makes it really hard to test with. Django 3.2 kind of corrects this by using a copy on write mechanism in memory. So whenever you read or whenever you change one of the model instances in memory during a test, that has a copy, not the version that you created in the class. So all the tests are well isolated.
Wow, that's interesting. I'll have to check that out. So this brings me to, do you develop in test-driven? Do you practice TDD, or are you whatever the opposite of TDD is? I don't know the acronym, but you write your code first and then test it. Which do you practice? Which methodology?
I feel like I'm a pragmatist there. I do a bit of both. So if I'm trying to fix a known bug or regression, I'll try and write the test first. But if I kind of know what I'm doing with the code, I'll write the code first. I like using coverage and getting to 100% coverage, because then I know that my tests are like testing everything. So I sometimes do like coverage-driven development. I've written a view. It's got a few branches. I'll start writing the tests. I'll write the first test that goes through the first branch, like an error condition. The second view that goes through, the thing doesn't exist in the database, and then I'll fill them out that way.
Got it. Okay. Wow. Okay. So other tips from your book that you might want to chat about? Sorry, I need to talk about test-driven development a little bit more.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Before we go back to your book, I realized that some people are just so adamantly TDD that they believe every other method is wrong. And I've never been a TDD person. Like I feel like I really like writing the code and then writing tests for it after I've kind of like flushed out what I want to happen in the code, versus like, oh, I for sure know what's going to happen, so I'm going to write a test for it, and then I'm going to write the code to the test. I feel like it's backwards in that writing tests first actually kind of pigeonhole you, whereas writing it after just verify the things that you've already done. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think definitely it can give you kind of blinkers. You're like trying to write the test first. It's a lot more work mentally, I think, as well, because you have to kind of think backwards and forwards at the same time. So you're like thinking backwards, like, okay, if I do this, then that should happen, and then you're like, okay, now I need to figure out how to do that in code, and then in the code you can encounter, this foreign key is nullable. What should I do if it's null? You have to deal with that case. But if you try and keep doing everything from the back only, and like the test and what the result should be, you can kind of get yourself in a tangle. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's like I read a fairly popular tweet that said, I don't remember who it's from, but it said basically anyone who doesn't do TDD is not a professional developer. I think they were trying to poke the box a little bit, but it was kind of like, okay, whatever. Like, but it had a lot of traction. People like really, really liked it. What's the like? How did this come about? Do you have any idea of like why TDD? Like people are just obsessed.
I think a number of books and things have popularized it. Like Martin Fowler and all his blog posts and similar things. Have just kind of become a gospel for some people. A book I like that is very TDD focused is the Obey the Testing Goat book. Do you know this one?
I don't think so.
By Harry Percival. It's also called Test-Driven Development in Django, I think. Okay. But it has this catchy title, Obey the Testing Goat. And it's an O'Reilly book with a goat, but you can read it free online. And he goes for the like absolutely pure TDD approach in his book. And he's like, before we even start the Django project, we're going to write a test that checks if the web server is running yet. And then we're going to go start the Django project and run server. And it kind of shows the absurdity of the position, but also it lets you get used to that way of thinking. And then he says, go back to being more pragmatic. And do this when it makes sense, like if you're trying to fix a bug or you definitely know what you want, but like balance it.
Interesting. I'll have to check that one out. Yeah. That sounds good. So back to your book. Any other like sure. Big red flags of like this is something that a lot of developers miss, that's low hanging fruit to either write better tests in general or to speed them up?
Yeah, parallelization is something some projects I've come into, they just missed. Like there's a flag inside Django's test runner, or there's a plugin for PyTest, and they're both minutes to set up. Assuming your test suite doesn't have any complicated independent interdependencies, you're going to see your tests multiply, like divide out by the number of cores you have. Yeah, that's a big win.
Yeah, it does it automatically. You don't need to specify the number of cores.
As in Django, if you do -- parallel, it will just use one process per core, which is
Great.
generally what you want. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Cool. And then as far as writing better tests.
well, going back to test data, which is a big topic. Some people go down the approach of like writing a base test case class for all their tests, and then in the setup method there, creating a user, and then the project gains the ability to have books, adding a book in there, and then an author, and then this just multiplies out. Every test is creating this whole world of data, and then using a tiny portion of it. So like keeping the data focused is pretty important.
Yeah. Wow, that I am definitely going to read your book. For as long as I've worked with Django, I feel like there's still so much I need to learn, and perhaps it's partially because of
same.
It's funny to hear you say that, but because it's like, I mean, you see all these different projects that are working in production as a consultant, and I think you probably glean a lot of experience from that. It sounded like that's what you said, and it's hilarious to hear you say, "Oh, you still have a lot of things to learn," and for how long we both have been working with it. Yeah. So switching from tests a little bit. Thanks for the advice. I appreciate it. But I definitely am going to have to read through your book and maybe more of your blog posts as well. But machine learning and Django, I get this question all the time as well as like, where does Django fit in the machine learning and deep learning like ecosystem, and should it even be a part of the conversation in terms of like the actual machine learning side of things, not like collecting data and all that. That's I think that's clear that Django can exist there, but actually handling the pipeline itself of machine learning. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the key use case for Django here is when you've built a model and you want to serve it to the web. Like either you're serving up some results, or you're actually running the model live in a request, like an API request comes in with data X and you have to output some prediction for it. I know there are a few things people have done, like there's a library called Django Pandas, which helps you integrate Pandas with Django models. I don't know of anything like particularly targeted at machine learning with Django at this point.
Yeah.
I guess there's space for more like advice, like how would you do it? Because there's always a machine learning library of the day. Yeah. How do you like get that within Django running in the same way?
Right. Now, I mean, have you served many machine learning models with Django, or do you not usually do that yourself very much?
I haven't for a while. I did work on one project where we're doing a recommendation system at a startup called YPlan. So we had a background model run, and the model needed like such different characteristics to our default celery cluster that it just ran on its own. But we came up with a solution where the model would write back the predictions for the day into the database as like individual rows. And then inside Django, we could read that. So it was really more about like bridging between the two systems than the model running inside Django, or Django really knowing anything about machine learning.
Got it. I've always thought that using something like Flask or Fast API is actually a really good way to serve a model that can be ran on a different instance or a different virtual machine, and then Django just communicates with that, so that it kind of, if there's things that happen with the model or the app itself, it doesn't pull down your entire Django application. But also just how lightweight it can be to just deploy a Fast API or Flask application in relation to building a whole Django project. Although what you built with the single page Django, you probably do it with that as well. But I mean, do you think that Django should be or serving the model itself, or do you think that my method of like using Flask or Fast API to serve the model makes more sense, or is it like a case by case? You can't make a blanket statement like that.
I think it can make a lot of sense to serve that model as a different service. Like one of the big things is also if the model has very large size, you really only want to run it on one process. You don't want to have duplicate copies of it in memory, because that will overwhelm even a normal machine. But on a typical website, you want to have multiple workers to serve requests. They don't use that much memory per request. So yeah, like putting it on a different machine makes a lot of sense. I think one thing I hope to show with my single file blog posts and its sequels, which cover different use cases, is that if you're a small team, you don't need to reach for another tool to make a 20-line thing that serves an HTTP endpoint. And when given some input, gives some output, you can do that with Django.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I would absolutely love, this maybe this is some food for thought for you, is Django-admin start micro project or something like that, where it's your version of that single page project. So that the best practices, or at least the way we see them, is there from the get-go. I think that'd be really cool.
That is possible. So the built-in start project takes a -- template argument, and this can be a URL. And I have a repo of a couple templates, one of which is the single file one.
Of course you do.
So it's not something I've really promoted, but
yeah, I always forget about the -- template because I'm so used to just Django start project. Do you use a lot of scaffolding tools, or do you use mostly templates? Or I guess you could do both.
So yeah, when I was writing the book, I was creating like 40 or 50 micro projects that come as the code samples. So I was using one of my templates a lot. But in my day-to-day work, I'm typically jumping into a pre-existing project. So it's not really anything to do there.
Yeah. So that makes sense. You're not making a bunch of projects like I am all the time. I do it because I'm teaching. So I start from the beginning, obviously. So I always use Django admin start project because it's like that's where most of us start. And if you use something like Cookie Cutter, that's great. But I need to do the templates. That's a really good idea for using things. I just, like I said, there's so much in Django. It's like easy to fall in love with it over and over again because of something like that. It's like a really simple thing to build a single page micro project. I'll have to find yours and start using it. I did do a tutorial. I did do a tutorial from your single page one. Totally reference you at it. I'm not trying to steal anything. I was just like obsessed with what you did because it's just so simple, and it was just like so eye-opening of like how simple Django can be with all of those advanced features still there, which is amazing. But the idea of just using a template, that's like the way to do it. I don't know.
There are so many like things like buried inside Django that need some love and promotion. I did another blog post recently about the Watchman integration on run server, which like massively decreases your CPU. It's a great bit of work that went into Django a few versions ago by one of the other now technical board members, Tom Forbes.
Yeah,
but we need like some way of like, we need people to keep recycling the ideas and promoting them and like saying, oh, there's this cool thing in Django I found.
Yeah. Can you describe what Watchman is? I know what it is, but I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So the built-in run server in Django, it basically does a loop, and every second it checks every single file in your project to see if you changed it. That becomes a lot of work on even a small project because it is also checking all your dependencies. So Watchman is a Facebook project that hooks into the operating system signals. You can ask the OS to tell you when files change. So Django has an integration with Watchman. It can't do all of that signaling stuff itself because it's a very large domain. You've got 4 or 5 OS integrations to worry about, and it's all in like a low-level C layer. So Django's integration with Watchman lets you use the Watchman tool to listen for changes. I've seen like a project go from 28% of one CPU core to 0%.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Save your battery. Yeah.
That So is Watchman then going to be a core feature to Run Server, or is it already?
It is already.
Okay.
It's just you have to go and install Watchman, and there's like this middle ground, right? Like a lot of tutorials tell you how to start a project.
Yep.
And a lot of people at large scale have found out all this stuff, but there's this middle where you're like, we need to continue telling people about this stuff, or put together some guides like scaling up Django.
Yeah, I mean, feel free, use me as a resource anytime. You guys, I would love to have more conversations with the technical board members, like I said earlier. But if you want to post things or whatever, you want to help get the word out, just let me know. Or maybe there's somewhere I should go, or all of us should go to help push some things like Watchman. That seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, cool.
And I'm shocked that I haven't been using it. Like I built a tool with Watchman recently, and I'm like, there's no way this thing works. Like, how is it so good? And like you said, the memory or the power usage is really, really low. So I guess they got me thinking, like, do you think that Django would ever be like parts of Django be compiled into C code to run faster? Or yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's an interesting question. I fiddled around with this once with a colleague. We didn't rewrite anything in C. We used Cython, which, if for those not familiar, you can put in Python code and compile it down into C, and it integrates with the C API. So even just copy-pasted Python code will run sometimes like 10 times faster. So we did this for the Django template language, some core pieces of it, and like made a package that if you install it, you get the C version rather than the Python version. And like in like micro benchmarks, yes, it showed up as really fast. But once integrated into a whole website, it didn't really appear in our APM metrics. There was like no real signal. I think there'd be more interest in making Python faster than in like making parts of Django faster. We have some low-hanging fruits probably in the code base where we're doing something that could be cached. People come across these all the time. But the Python itself is begging to be sped up. There are a bunch of different projects that are trying to do that. It's a matter of getting some of them like really stable and maybe into the C Python interpreter so everyone can use those advantages.
Yeah, absolutely. I do hear a lot from people that Python's too slow, so you shouldn't use Django, which is like kind of silly. But I mean, do you think there's any validity to that statement at all?
I think it's probably not true for 99% of websites. I mean, most websites these days are slowed down in the browser by a bunch of JavaScript. The fact that the backend responds in 200 milliseconds rather than 100 milliseconds if you use Go doesn't matter, because the end user is waiting for 10 seconds of JavaScript ads to appear and integrations. Yeah, I think most people couldn't even notice the difference between a backend that's served with Django versus one served with Go.
Yeah. I tend to agree. So the JavaScript side of things, do you see a future where there's another kind of, I don't want to say template like the Django templating system, but something that sort of replaces that's pretty much JavaScript or ready for React or Vue or Angular, and it's more geared towards serving those things as like the static version of those files versus, I mean, there's definitely ways to do it, but do you think that's going to be part of Django's core team at some point where the front end is pretty much controlled by JavaScript, but then rendered as a static file? Do you think that's going to be part of Django?
The problem with like the SPA thing is that there are like 1,000 ways to skin the cat. There's, React, Vue, Ember, they all come with different ways of setting it up. I think there's no like key feature missing from Django to use any of these frameworks. Yep. You probably build an API, so you'll reach for Django REST framework. But if you're building like a SPA with a JS bundle, then it's really up to you to build a pipeline where you do your JavaScript stuff, you put the bundle in Django static files, and then Django serves that bundle without really knowing what's in it. Yep. It doesn't need to. It's all running over there on the browser.
So one of the things that speeds up like a React.js project, for example, or maybe not speeds up, but it definitely improves for SEO, is the server-side rendering of these files. So server-side rendering of a React project. And as far as I know, there's not a really good way to do that in Django because of a myriad of reasons. But I mean, do you know of a way? And I guess, like, is there going to be a Django.js essentially where it's essentially very similar to React or Vue, but it kind of handles from a JavaScript side of things the Django templating? that sounds ridiculous even to ask it, but I wanted to.
So like you want a hybrid server that if a request is for React, it gets rendered through React. If a request is for a Django view, then it goes through the Django view, which is normally going to be your API.
Yeah.
I think the typical deployment for that would be to put something like Nginx in front that splits the requests by the path. So you have Django /API and maybe like your admin URL, whatever that is, and then everything else gets rendered by React. I've also worked with a system that went the other way, that if there was a URL missing Django, then Django would reach out to the running node process and get that to render that page.
Interesting.
I think either of those is the right way.
Yeah. So thank you for clarifying my bad question. Nginx is the tool. That's how you can separate these things out. And the reason I try to put it in terms of Django as well is because I get this question a lot where, you know, there are a lot of people want Django to solve all these problems for them, myself included, right? Like I would love for Django to do a lot of these things, but it's not always the right tool. So do you think like learning Nginx and being really good at Nginx is like maybe one of the next paths to being better at Django, because then you can understand how to run multiple Django projects under one Nginx or so on?
Yeah, I don't think you need to be really good at Nginx. Like, at the end of the day, it's a configuration language with a few, like, if this, that, and you only need to learn the pieces that your project needs right now.
Sure.
It has a lot of things. It's a bit like Django, right? It's got different middleware that you could plug into how requests get served.
Yep.
But for most things, you're just going to need a few location blocks, and you can find many different tutorials around that.
Yeah, cool. All right, Adam. Well, I know you said you got to get going, so this was great. Thanks for letting me fumble over my words here and there. I'm just like, I'm trying to ask you good questions, and hopefully I had a couple. But I find a lot of the work that you do really interesting. And if there's something with the Django development team or the technical team, and you guys all want to come and have a chat, let's do it. Or if you want to come back on anytime, I think that I contribute to Django, but I would love to contribute more directly if I can. So do keep me in mind for things like Watchmen and your templates and some of your other stuff. But thanks again for coming on, and I'm looking forward to looking forward to checking out your book more and reading from your blog post too. So
thank you very much for having me. Have a good morning there in LA.
Thanks. Have a good evening in London. One last thing is, where should people find you? I do have some of the links in the description, but is there a preferred place to find you and connect with you some more?
I've got my website, adamj.eu, has all my contact details on there. Go and follow me on Twitter. I'm at adamchains.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam.
Cool. Thank you very much.